So originally I set out to do this video on all the controllers I've yet to unbox this year. And while I'm still going to do that, I figured why not take a look at these accessories a bit more in depth while we do. So with that, hey gamers, welcome to the dojo. See, controllers are the way we interact with the medium that is video games, quite literally. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and form factors and colors and technology, you name it. See, the first ever controller is touted to be this simple dial and button for the 1958 game Tennis for Two, one of the very first video games. And over time, controllers have only advanced and have only evolved. We're talking joysticks, touch sensors, various Wi-Fi technology and wireless to connect it. And these controllers have, branched out for a simple game like table tennis for two to, sim car racers and flight sims and retro controllers and fight sticks. These have all kind of stood the test of time and have iterated in tandem with the games and the medium itself. Okay, now for the original purpose of this video, the main backlog of controllers I've gotten this year. Most of these were in part of for collectors purposes, in that they were special editions or certain variants of existing controllers I already have, and don't necessarily add anything other than a personalized feel from that of a standard, Nintendo Switch Pro controller and what have you. But some of this also just kind of stems from trying to find the perfect controller for specific consoles. Being a retro modern collector, I'm sure it's a battle that we've all kind of tackled in some aspects. Okay, so first up here is one of those examples of just a controller that I got for the sake of collection purposes and to kind of fill one of those holes in an ongoing collection that I have, and that's anything related to The Legend of Zelda. So this is the TOTK, or the Tears of the Kingdom Edition Pro controller. And this is one that I got off a good friend in the community, Deathlord, who gave me a really great deal on this. And it's simply a variant of the standard Pro controller, which happens to be one of the controllers that I tend to use the most when it came to the Switch. I prefer this easily over the Joy-Cons, even though I know the Joy-Cons have a lot of tech built into them. This has always been one of the kind of standard controllers I've always used. And given that I have the Switch mainly for party game purposes, a controller that I try to frequently have stocked and charged. So having more of them never hurts. Now, this was open prior in the past. I haven't opened it since I got it. At least I think I may have just cut it open. But it's still pretty much, as you can see here, all in its standard wrapping. At the end of the day, these things should and deserve to be used, right? So here we have it. This is the, that's not a fun sound. The Tears of the Kingdom Switch Pro controller, which is just super, super clean here. Has that white grip, has that gold kind of accents, and pretty much outside of that, the standard, Pro controller layout and buttons, just, that matching design to go alongside something like, for example, the Tears of the Kingdom Switch. And that leads me to my first interjection of this video. If you thought this was just going to be standard run-of-the-mill unboxing, well, strap in. See, I wanted to think about the first category of when it came to just favorite controllers that kind of stick out. And go beyond just the classic, what is the one I use the most, what's my favorite overall, which we're going to address regardless. But I wanted to start out with one that I hate to love, and in the sense that it's something that I'm familiar with, it's something that's nostalgic, but in practicality and in modern ages, something that, I don't really see as practical of a controller. So it's without a doubt the Nintendo 64 controller, and in particular this atomic purple one that I had as a kid that sticks out to me so much. This is highly unergonomic with its kind of three-pronged design, and it's one that I quite never really knew how to ideally hold properly. I know Nintendo's whole thing was based on the game that you're playing, you might use the D-pad or the analog stick, but I cherish it nonetheless due to its nostalgic, overall feel and look and overall design. Playing with my sisters in our hallway on our CRT TV with our standard kind of atomic purple and our gray one. Mario Party mini games at friends' houses where you'd complain if you had the worn out stick for the games that required rotating this and would cause, third-degree burns on your palms. You get the idea. This is one that in itself was like the first times I could recall being exposed to just a controller design like this. Like I remember I always wanted to play with the atomic purple one because I thought it was better just because it looked cooler, right? And to kind of see the inner workings of the tech behind this thing that I use on the daily. And that leads me to unboxing a controller that I've also had for quite some time. That is the perfect segue, and that is the Nintendo 64 controller specifically for NSO, or Nintendo Switch Online. Truth be told, I got this a while back with my modded N64. My smoke gray actually came with this and a special adapter to use with the standard N64 to adapt controllers like this. But controllers like this lead me to a category that we'll talk a little bit more in depth later on, and it's the idea of modern revisions of retro controllers. And I think this is the epitome of something that, while in itself was not, in my opinion, the best design and doesn't always hold up that great, there is something to be said about the design and having it adapted for the modern console and things like NSO or Nintendo Switch Online, so you can play with original feeling hardware on these kind of emulated platforms. Now, this is another one of those instances where I believe this was opened in the past when I got it, but essentially, for all intents and purposes, this is a Nintendo 64 controller, right? This is that same 3-prong, has a very nice tight stick, very responsive, and has a standard kind of buttons here. But, of course, you have a much more modern technology with this built-in, wireless battery pack and Bluetooth capability and ability to pair this with something like a Nintendo Switch or with the right adapter, any console that supports Bluetooth wireless controllers. So this is that same design and feel that I was used to as a kid with modern conveniences built in. You don't have to have that cord that's plugged in, a couple feet away from your TV. You can have the convenience of wireless tech and sitting on your couch and enjoying that modern/retro gaming experience. All right, back to looking at some of the other controllers I had in the backlog here. This is the Cool Pad from Sega Saturn, for the Sega Saturn. Funny enough, I just realized it had a not for sale sticker on it. I don't recall if this is... Actually, I think this might be first party, like truly first party. This is a controller that I had gotten for the Sega Saturn, which is a console that I never had growing up, was before my time in truth, and a console that I've been wanting to kind of get in like my retro Ultimate series, but just never really got the time to mess around with the Saturns that I do have. But I did want like a more modern controller, and I was at a gaming trade show where a vendor that I know had one of these, and he gave me a decent deal on it, so I decided to pick it up. So this is the 6-button kind of configuration for the Sega Saturn, and the reason I really wanted this is, again, kind of harkening back to the N64 controller. I'm a sucker for these kind of translucent, transparent controller designs, as you'll see with some of my retro consoles and whatnot. But this also adapts the kind of 6-button layout with ABC, X, Y, Z. You have this more functional D-pad here, and I really like if you can kind of hear that, the clickiness of these trigger buttons there, or shoulder buttons. But nonetheless, this is one that I was excited to pick up in terms of its design, look and feel, and the ability, of course, to hook it up natively to the Sega Saturn. So that's been sitting in the box for quite a while. Next on the list was a controller I got back at SoCal Gaming Expo. And this was just a deal that I got on a controller for the PlayStation 5. I've been looking to add more PS5 controllers to my overall library, mostly because when I do want to play like multiplayer games with friends, ideally for my modern consoles like the PlayStation 5, I want to have at least minimum for controllers. And this is one of those special edition controllers. This is one that some people may not be a fan of, but this is the LeBron James edition. I believe this came out with alongside like face plates and stuff for the PlayStation 5. So this has been out for quite some time. I remember at one point you can get these on sale on the PlayStation official store for a decent price. So this is just a standard run-of-the-mill PlayStation 5 controller. This is not anything special. It's on a PS5 like Pro controller. Essentially, it's the PlayStation 5 like black controller with just faceplate on it. And while I unbox this, I'm just going to jump into my next category of controller, and that is just my overall favorite controller. And I think it's perfect with this because it comes down to the PlayStation 2 controller, the standard DualShock 2 controller that I have all coiled up like I did back in the day. But I think this is a perfect segue into unboxing this, because this right here is like nostalgia at its finest for me. The N64 was like my first console. The PlayStation 2 was the first console that I got to truly dive into the library of, and at that point, having come from the N64, was just such a technological leap and jump from console graphics and pure library of games. Hands down, when it came to this form factor, in my opinion, this has stood the kind of test of time through the years, coming from the original PlayStation controller to the, DualShock 2, and evolving from the PS3 and PS4 into now the PS5. And it's always going to be my favorite. It's a design language for me that has essentially stayed the same through all the generations, while improving, of course, on like core tech and adding different things throughout. The size, the weight, the general button layout, it's something that just feels so familiar to me. It fits like a glove in my hands, and hands down, it's always going to be my overall favorite controller. And with that, back to the unboxing at hand. From there, we've come all the way to the PlayStation 5 controller, which, truth be told, in terms of like controller, next-gen controller layouts, this was, at the time when this came out in comparison to the Series X, I think clearly the winner. Like, I think just the overall tech that they built in here, from like the sensors and the haptic feedback and like the built-in speaker, and more importantly, how this integrated with games. I remember games like Ghost of Tsushima, where the wind that you would use to direct you and guide you throughout the levels, you would hear it coming out of this controller. Obviously, games like Astrobot and other samples that came out early on, and now with the new Astrobot, take that technology and have like evolved it to the next level, where you can kind of feel that feedback, the triggers and the sensitivity that you can feel there in a game like even NBA 2K, where your players are tired and don't have the stamina. The weight of these becomes heavier, and the resistance becomes heavier. This is the iteration of that original PlayStation controller to what is now modern day PlayStation 5. The next controller in my stack is a controller that I had originally gotten. Actually, this is for our office. We have a little lounge area, and I wanted to get a couple controllers because we had a Nintendo Switch that I had put out there, but it also gave me an opportunity to kind of test out some third-party controllers. So I had gotten one of the 8BitDo controllers, and I also got this 8BitDo Ultimate controller, or Bluetooth controller, because it was more affordable in comparison to something like the Pro controller natively. But from what I've heard, packs a lot of the features and as close as you can get to it, while still being a controller that is multifunctional, because you can use this across things like the Nintendo Switch, Windows, anything that really accepts a Bluetooth controller. 8BitDo or 8BitDo, however you want to call them, is very known for their accessories and controllers and whatnot. So this is a line of controllers that has been very popular, especially in that of like the retro scene in space, because of the ability to use this as like a almost all-in-one controller for things like emulation or what have you. Mistaken, by the time I'm unboxing this, I think there's a version 2 out of this already since then. But the thing that's really great about this is, oh wow, that feels awesome. It has this kind of dock that the controller just kind of sits and snaps into. It almost feels magnetic, but I think it's just kind of the way it sits and feels. And I love like a good dock like this for a controller, because it makes it easy to charge while still displaying it, and it's included in something like this which is already by itself cheaper than a first-party controller. That being said, it has some high-quality analog sticks from what I've seen. You have that standard kind of button layout. You have your standard kind of triggers here, R1, R2, L1, L2. And then you even get things like these paddle buttons in the back, which you typically see in more like pro and or higher end controllers. And you have a pretty good bang for buck value there when it comes to this controller. And in my experience, at least with 8BitDo's other products, it doesn't really disappoint, especially for the price point you're getting this at. So now, before we move to the last controller in the stack, I want to talk about my next category of favorite controllers. And I'd be remiss if I didn't at least acknowledge the controller and the form factor that has probably been the longest standing and all too familiar of a format that I quite literally interact with it every day. And that is call it the keyboard warrior or the mouse and keyboard combination. I consider this, for the most part, a controller, especially for those of you out there who are PC gamers. You're all too familiar with the kind of lengths you can go to get a solid mouse and keyboard setup. I've interacted with a keyboard for the better part of 20 plus years on a daily basis, and despite traditionally preferring a controller natively, the keyboard and mouse form factor is just something that, in essence, is just, again, so familiar. Point, click, press a button. My earliest memories of gaming are tied to, in part, using a keyboard and mouse, whether it's RuneScape or World of Warcraft, like games like that. I can't imagine playing an MMO like WoW on a standard, controller, for example. Even back then, I remember early games like StarCraft Brood Wars. I had no idea how you would play that on something like a console back then, but lo and behold, they had ports for StarCraft on things like the N64 and whatnot.
I need to change my keybind for grenade.
Amidst all the like macros and the pure number of just sheer buttons that you get at your disposal with a keyboard, it offers its own rabbit hole of customizations and options to match your preference. You can get different keycaps, you can get different boards. This one weighs like well over 3-4 pounds. It's heavy for what it is. Like, this could be a weapon in the wrong hands. The mechanical whole nature of these things, and the people who, like myself, get into the hobby of getting different switches and lubing your keycaps and switches and adding foam to get it to the right, acoustic preference. Again, it's a whole other subset of a hobby in itself, but nonetheless, this plus something like this are by all means a controller. It's how you interact with PC games, and the precision and the options and the customability that something like this offers you with, again, the sheer amount of buttons enables you to play certain games differently, or games that you wouldn't be able to maybe necessarily fully interact with or achieve on the console-like experience or with a standard controller format. Thus, leading me to the final controller in the stack and my most recent pickup, and that is yet another PlayStation 5 controller. In this case, the limited edition 30th anniversary PlayStation 5 controller. And this one is just a cool one. The nerd in me, the collector in me, I think PlayStation and Sony in particular did a really great job with this 30th anniversary edition. Everything from the packaging details, the classic PlayStation logo, obviously that kind of classic gray with the traditional PlayStation logo here. They really did go all out for this 30th anniversary line because they came out with so many different products for this that it's kind of tough to get these right now, unfairly so. And again, this could sit in the box and it can accrue value, and I'm sure for certain resellers it will be worth something down the road because of some supply and demand. But again, these are controllers. They're meant to be used now in the box, and I'm a fair representation of that. If somebody who's just been not necessarily stacking these up for resale or anything of the sort, but purely just lazy. But here we have it, simple packaging in the box. I think the only other thing you're going to get in here is the USB-C cable, or do they not even? No, do they actually not even include that for the 30th anniversary? Surprising. I thought they would at least give you the cable for the price of this. But look at that. That is just looks even cooler in person there. So this is the PS5, again, 30th anniversary edition Just a standard controller. They do have a pro model, if I'm not mistaken. I already have one of those controllers, so opted to just get this regular one. And here's the thing with these special edition controllers. They are meant to be used, to be played. And while the collector in me appreciates these for what they are, and in some cases the rarity and so on, they're not necessarily anything that gives them a true advantage or accessibility or ease of use, right? Like, for example, my PS5 Pro controller, or the I don't necessarily think they call this the Pro controller, whatever they call this, DualSense Edge Wireless. No, that's definitely not what they call it. That's just overall the controller. I'm gonna call this a Pro controller. Or my Series X kind of elite controller compared to the standard Xbox controller. It offers certain functionalities that make this more accessible or ease of use, right? The trigger hair adjustments and the kind of adjustments there, the back paddles that you can add and customize, the removable plate to adjust the analog sticks, where I have 3 different analog sticks and heights that I can adjust to. They don't, necessarily, maybe depending on your viewpoint, make it unfair, but they do give me certain ease of use or accessibility options that at least change the feel of the controller, and maybe you can argue give you some sort of advantage in game. But the literal definition of these things is, at the end of the day, they're controllers and they're meant to be used, right? I've honestly just have these in the box more so due to laziness, like I said, than anything. And on the collection side, they are both, I think, like the most practical and non-practical thing in a way that you can collect, I believe, as a collector, because at the end of the day, they are controllers, and they're physically meant to be used in events of like having multiple people over, when you have like friends over to play, or local, co-op and stuff like that. It's nice to have, again, multiple controllers, even if it's for when your controller may break or go bad. And unfortunately, that happens to be things with some controllers nowadays, more than it should. It's one of those things where it's nice to have, some of these on hand. But at the same time, there's so many different special editions, or just so many different kind of iterations that you can get. There's so many different third-party ones that you can get that quickly, having 1 or 2 controllers can kind of get out of hand, and you have more than you need, and you have a stockpile of these things, and they become display pieces. And that's okay too, a little bit, depending on your preference. I mean, case in point. Now, the one thing I will say as a collector of both retro and modern gaming hardware, that this further fueled this kind of controller rabbit hole and hunt for the quote-unquote like perfect controller, is it gets started with what I would call stages, right? If you were a collector, you've probably gone through something similar. You start off by getting like the OG controllers, first party, the original hardware. And these are controllers that allow you to relive the classic feel, the vibe of a console, and how it was originally. And as some collectors or gamers will say, play it the way that it was meant to be played, because you can't necessarily replicate things like the OG Dreamcast form factor, and the fact that it does require physically something like a VMU that was like a hardware attachment that went in conjunction with it. And, classic original controllers that work with that kind of first-party hardware and feel, that only a way a first-party controller could work. And look, there is something I will say for just having the nostalgia for something that just feels the way it did originally. And that's why I think a lot of people either use like the standard OG controllers when it comes to things like speedrunning, for example, where precision and accuracy is super important. And I think there's a level of people who just prefer using the OG hardware because of the way they know the game to feel, or how the notches feel on a standard GameCube controller for things like Smash. And then on the opposite spectrum, you have people who take that and elevate that to the next level, who mod these controllers to no end, adding paracords and fancy cables and even deeper notches and, improved analog sticks and all these sorts of things. But that then leads you into phase 2, which I think is this kind of evolving up from the OG controllers and getting away from some of the inconveniences that those first-party controllers had, and that introduces you to what I would call modern retro controllers. And this is that kind of phase 2 hunt you can go for, where you go from that original Dreamcast controller and you go to something like this. This is the Retro Fighters Striker DC that is completely wireless. It has an external thing for a VMU if you still want to use a VMU, but this is completely wireless. This charges with USB-C. This is much lighter and in a form factor that probably feels more ergonomic and akin to a standard controller. Or this Retro Fighters for the PlayStation 2, PlayStation 1, and PlayStation 3. This is quite literally a wireless controller that has a physical adapter that can work with those 3 consoles. And again, gives you a much more familiar layout and feel while being adaptable to, again, modern controllers. It has the rumble built in, has vibration, charges via USB-C, and it works, again, across 3 generations of consoles while maintaining that same design language. And the rabbit hole for modern retro controllers only goes further, because outside of third-party controllers, you have things like adapters that allow certain controllers to work with other consoles. There's adapters that can allow N64 to pair with any Bluetooth controller, and I can play, my N64 with, my Joy-Cons or something like that. And much, much more when you get further into things like the modding community. You can get specific custom controllers to customize to your look and feel, where you can get custom shells and, buttons and things of that nature to not just change the personalization, but again, add that modern day convenience. There's kits that are sold to take OG controllers like the GameCube or the N64 and add wireless components and stuff to it while reusing the original housing. So you then go from looking for the perfect controller per console to ideally looking for the perfect one for maybe multiple consoles. And that's the hard thing. And I think the argument of a universal controller is difficult in that there's many different standards and layouts and things that just make certain consoles what they are. The C stick and the C buttons for the Nintendo 64 and the GameCube are unique to this controller, and it makes sense in the form factor in which they exist. Whereas if you adapt a modern controller like, the Switch Pro, they try to do things that make those work, but again, sometimes fall short. So maybe one day the perfect controller is one that is modular or customizable. I mean, companies have certainly tried with things like the Steam controller from back in the day that integrated these wireless touchpads and had a lot of customability and all sorts of things. And maybe this was a jumpstart for a platform, something like this, that will evolve into what we've seen in the years to come and we'll continue to see. Maybe the perfect controller is quite literally one that we already have, with things like a keyboard that just have so much versatility and options, and again, just due to the pure button layout, can almost emulate any console out there. And with that, gamers, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, consider subscribing for more gaming content. And this was a fun one for me, just to kind of dive through some of the history of controllers, the controllers that I have, my view on some of these things, and this hobby that we all endure in, while also allowing me to get through the backlog of the controllers I needed to unbox, and now, hopefully, put to use. So what's your favorite controller? And ideally, what does the best or perfect controller look like to you? Thanks for watching, gamers. I'll catch you in the next one.